貴殿に誠心誠意の謝意を伝えさせてくれ、ロドスのドクター。私のような故郷を追われた取るに足らない輩を受け入れてくれて感謝する。非才なる好みであってもロドスの事業に貢献できるのであれば喜ばしいことだ。
Welcome back to another appointment, Doctor. Today we are going to discuss on a very special operator that we have in Rose Island for a very interesting reputation, and that is Ebenholz. Ebenholz is a 6-star Mystic Caster that specializes in boss killing, mob clearing with a little bit of pull control. Like other Mystic Casters, Ebenholz can charge up to 3 attacks when he is unable to find target within the next attack. Compared to his other lower rarity alternatives, being able to focus on specific enemies is a good thing for this archetype. This archetype is meant to be source of arts burst damage, and you want to use this archetype only if they have their stored attacks. Indigo does fit within this role, but she significantly reduces her damage and her role is more of a support than damage dealer. As for Iris, she does put 2 enemies to sleep, which gives her some time to charge her attacks, but this won't be the case if she's facing more than 2 enemies because she can store her charges at this point. Harmony, who is an upcoming Mystic Caster, will only prioritize enemies that are blocked while also slowing them down. As far as I know, people who I know using her says that her experience feels like if you're using Rosmontes, so take that as you will. Ebenholz on the other hand ignores all enemies except bosses and elite enemies, which is great because you want to get rid of bosses and elite enemies as fast as possible since they can be a huge threat for your operators. Ebenholz possesses 2 passive talents that allows him to help his niche even further. His first talent allows him to increase his stored attacks up to 135% and gives him additional stored attacks by 1. This additional stored attack will be fired when he is attacking a boss or elite enemy. The talent by itself is quite straightforward as this increases Ebenholz's straight damage even further and deals further damage to bosses or elites because of the additional charge. You can see this additional charge when this red sparkle appears on Ebenholz's hand. As for his second talent, this allows him to increase damage to the target by 17% of his attack when there's no enemies within the target's range. However, as far as I observed, this talent does not affect his stored attacks. I don't know why it works like that, but based on my calculation and how I observed this skill from countless tests with his third skill, this talent does not affect his stored attacks at all, so apparently his stored attacks are not considered as attack. It could be a bug, but again they never fixed it, so it's probably intended as is. As you can see from these 2 talents, it is clear that these talents helps him to increase his damage output to boss enemies, which these 2 talents will be very beneficial to his third skill later on. Now we're going to talk on Ebenholz's module. His first module allows his trait to charge up to 4 attacks instead of 3 and also increase the multipliers of his first talent. This allows him to deal even more damage to the target and allows him to charge up to 5 attacks. With this module, this allows him to fully utilize his third skill to the maximum potential to deal insane burst damage to your enemies. This module has impressive synergy with his third skill to bring one of the highest arts burst damage that you will ever see in this game, and because of that alone, this module gives Ebenholz potential to one-shot enemies within his range. This module also has decent synergy with his second skill, although his second module is better for that role. This is a must-have module if you want to fully utilize him as a boss killer, since the difference between with and without the module are quite significant. As for his second module, it allows him to gain 30 points of attack speed while holding stored attacks and increase the multipliers of his second talent. Additionally, this module adds another effect where Ebenholz will deal 36% AoE damage when there's enemies nearby the target, and the AoE is smaller than Eyjafjalla's second skill AoE. Considering that his first talent allows him to recover 1 stored attacks and use it for bosses, this makes him able to gain 30 points of attack speed until he hits the next elite, making him attack and store faster. It's also worth noting that Ebenholz's attacks are considered as separate attacks, so the amount of AoE damage is equal to how much stored attacks hit the enemy. So to put it simply, his first module is the best option for boss killing while his second module is the best option for general use. Like other Mystic Caster first skill, this skill is simply not worth investing. Of course, being a 6-star, he has better damage and has some synergy with his second module, but you would never use this skill over his second skill. With all that being said, let's take a look on how it looks. This skill allows him to become a mob clearer and generally his best option for general use. To summon, Ebenholz will consume all of his stored attacks to create summons called All the Remnant that lasts 30 seconds each, and if Ebenholz has no stored attacks, he will summon 1 Remnant instead. So in minimum, he will summon 1 Remnant and at a maximum of 5 Remnants thanks to his talent. If you have his first module activated, then he will summon 6 Remnant instead. Despite being stated that he will consume all of his stored attacks, he only consumed them equal to the amount of empty tiles available. The remnants can be summoned on rage tile as well. Even if Ebenholz only able to do 1 summon, you also have to remember that Ebenholz has very high base attack thanks to him being a mystic caster. So even then, that remnant still deal a lot of damage. To put it simply, you can treat this skill as W second skill but with arts damage and pull instead. And like W, it targets the nearest enemy from the base, and when there's no enemies in range, the placement will be randomized. The skill on its own has issues, being that lighter enemies can trigger the remnants way too much because of the pull, lowering his DPS potential. Usually this pull mechanic can be a bad thing even with heavier enemies since it can activate the remnants when you don't want to yet. Especially it has 3x3 hitbox, but the biggest issue is that Ebenholz might attack an enemy, making the stored attacks wasted to summon more remnants. With that being said, you might want to put Ebenholz as far from the enemy's spawning point as possible. I also would like to point out that same like Ebenholz's stored attacks, his remnants are apparently not considered as attack from his talent, so the remnants won't trigger Ebenholz's second module. Anyway, here's how the skill works. This skill is definitely his bread and butter as it synergizes with his talent and his archetype the most. Despite its low attack upgrade than other operators in general, 65% is still a massive attack upgrade for Ebenholz since he already has high base attack to begin with. This skill also increases his talent damage even further, making this skill able to bring ridiculous amount of burst damage to your boss target by himself even without buffs. And since this skill allows him to ignore other enemies that are not elites or boss enemies, this makes him able to charge his attacks without worrying wasted charge attacks. Typically, you want to cast this skill a bit early before the boss or elites enter his range so he can start to recharge faster, and as far as I observe, Ebenholz will always prioritize bosses over elites, which makes it more convenient for Ebenholz to focus on the boss instead. This skill can also be deactivated whenever you want, so you can use this skill if you just want to recharge his charge attacks faster without getting distracted, or you can deactivate it once the boss or your elite target is defeated. There are issues within the skill, but we'll discuss about that later. For now, let's take a look on how the skill performs. We can't discuss Ebenholz without addressing the elephant in the room. Now here is the problem. I actually have to rewrite this script because it was too long for me to explain everything, and frankly I got very valuable feedback about my recent videos by a special someone, which is why you see me refer to the old format, and if that special someone saying this, yes, I read that. Hi! But to cut it short, you can see the calculation on your screen. Ebenholz right now has the highest burst damage in the game, dealing at over 30,000 arts damage and buff on his first hit. That number is absolutely insane, and no one in this game can ever do that. Other broken operators can, even Conviction and Chanka can't reach that number on their own. But why he is considered as terrible? There has to be a reason, right? Yes, and that is after that hit. The damage is very low after the first hit, and the only thing that is supporting him after that is his second talent, which is not that much to begin with. What makes it even worse is that he doesn't have any resistance threat or ignore resistance, which makes him struggle against enemies with high arts resistance. So if you're facing enemies with 50 arts resistance for example, which that should be almost every single bosses in this game, his initial hits gets reduced even further by half, and the damage after that hit can barely do anything to your target. Now don't get me wrong, he still have high damage potential, and this skill is still usable enough as elite killers and one shot them without hassle even if they have decent arts resistance because they have lower HP pool. Now the best way to use him would be with a support, and if it should be his best option since she has the most resistance threat in this game. This alone is already strong enough for Ebenholz to deal more noticeable damage to boss enemies. Unless you want to use him as a one shot, which is the best option for that role as of now, you do need more than just Ifrit most of the time. If you want cheaper option, then Pramanix is an alternative, and to some, she is also much easier to use than Ifrit due to her wider range and cheaper DP cost. She is not the best option since you have other operators who are not complete death weight, and she is still an okay pick if you don't have anyone else. Anyway, his third skill is basically what makes him one of the worst operators out there, and is my opinion the same as the mainstream opinion, as how triggering as this can get. Personally, I don't find him bad, but he is very middling. I think this has become somewhat a trend within the community that an operator is bad if they have to use a support to make them good, and I personally don't agree with this notion. Yes, I did say plenty of times in the past that it is better if an operator can do something on their own, but even if X needs Y to be excellent, then that's okay. If you want to know more about that, then there's a video explain about it in more detail, linked down below. I do think, however, that what he offered with the amount of materials he needs is not worth the cost, but again, it's not like you can't make him deal significant amount of damage with just one support anyway. If you follow me long enough, you know that I test a lot. By a lot, I mean a lot of bad operators in the past. So far, my opinion on the worst operator does not change, and that is Tsukinogi, Frostleaf, and with the new addition, Windfleet. Personally, an operator is bad if they don't bring noticeable contribution or difference to the team, or if you're a damage dealer, you don't deal consistent damage or very negligible damage to your team. Ebenholz is far from that. Yes, after his first hit is terrible, but just with a little bit of debuff, the damage is very different than it was before. Unlike other terrible operators I tested in the past, this is not the case because you need more than just one support to make them decent enough on what they do, or using them is just very impractical, and you can see this example with my Tomimi showcase I did eons ago. There is a difference between needing support but still practical, and needing support and works but still impractical. Frankly, doing one-shot Ebenholz works, but is extremely impractical, and you can't do that on hard or extreme mode stages most of the time, but even without that, you can just use one of the debuffers and get the job done even if you can't one-shot. Now look, what I said here are still very surface scratching, and I can explain way more than what I said if I want to, because I have a lot of experience in that field, but that is a topic for another day because if I do that now, we can be here all day. I always have a principle whether I'm playing Our Knights or Genshin Impact, if it dies, and that applies the same here. Yes, there are operators such as Surtur and Pozemka who does the role better, but again not everyone has them, and if you're left with only Ebenholz as your only option, then remember that he still do his job very well as long as you gave him a proper support for that. To wrap this video up, Ebenholz is more of a luxury operator. He is not amazing, but he is not terrible either. I personally think he is more of a meme operator since it's really fun to see bosses getting one-shot by this Luthanian conductor, but as general use, he needs debuffs to make his damage more noticeable, but the difference is very significant, and bringing one debuff to your team is not a terrible thing at all. In fact, that's a smart move because you know how to effectively clear the stage faster and make it easier for yourself. With that being said, I don't highly recommend you building Ebenholz early, but it can be worth considering as long as you have proper support to make him work as intended. And that sums up for disappointment. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider like the video because it helped this channel getting more noticed by the algorithm. If you don't want to miss out my videos, consider subscribing to my channel. If you have any thoughts, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. With that being said, thank you so much for watching and I'll see you in our next appointment. This is Neko signing out. Have a nice day and best of luck at hunting, Doctor.
Maybe I'm a little too shy, always trying to be the wise guy. The thought of you under the moonlight is running all over my mind.